At the beginning of the film, we see an astronaut named Mark Watney who is left alone on Mars with no food or water. To his dismay, there is nothing he can utilize to contact NASA for assistance. Then in a flashback to a day ago, we see a squad of NASA astronauts conducting research on Mars. While collecting sand samples, they are informed by their Earth-based crew that they must evacuate Mars as soon as possible since a storm is approaching. The squad quickly packs their belongings and rushes towards their spacecraft. The storm appears out of nowhere and strikes them. It quickly spread havoc throughout the entire area. Although the astronauts were very close to reaching their spacecraft, a piece of equipment strikes Mark Watney and drags him along in a hurricane. The group makes every effort to find him but fails and decides to leave Mars. They believe Mark has died by now, so they notify NASA headquarters and begin their journey back to Earth. However, as the hurricane ends, Mark wakes up covered in sand. He is poked in the stomach by one of their tools, but he does not pull it out to maintain atmospheric pressure. Mark walks over to his bunker, pulls out the tool poked in his stomach, and sutures his wound. The next NASA project on Mars will be in 4 years, and since all of the equipment Mark can use to communicate with his Earth-based crew has been destroyed, he will have to live on Mars for the next 4 years, which is nearly impossible. Instead of dreading death, he chooses to handle his nerves and pinpoint the location where NASA would arrive for their operation after 4 years, but to his dismay, that location is 3,200 kilometers away from where he is now. Mark checks the entire bunker for available food and takes notes on everything. He calculates that if he eats even less than usual, he will barely have enough food for a year. As a botanist, he chooses to plant potatoes on Mars. He gathers a lot of soil in a compartment and puts small potatoes in it, hoping to harvest his potatoes shortly. Because the crop requires a lot of water and there is no water on Mars, he decides to produce water. As a scientist, he understands that by igniting hydrogen and oxygen, he can produce water. Without wasting a moment, Mark ignites oxygen with hydrogen, resulting in an unexpected explosion because he hasn't calculated the amount of oxygen he is inhaling. He amazingly succeeds on the second try, and water begins to appear in the form of drops, and the potato fields receive water to grow. After a few days, Mark receives good news: the first plant in his potato field has finally popped out of the earth. Meanwhile, on Earth, NASA holds a press conference in which CEO Teddy Sanders informs everyone that the Mars mission was a success but that one of their astronauts, Mark Watney, unfortunately, perished. They arrange Mark's funeral as well, in honor of his commitment. However, the next day, a NASA employee named Mindy sees some movement on Mars via satellite images. She notices that the solar panels left by the astronauts have been relocated. She instantly informs NASA's director, Vincent Kapoor, of this. Mark repositioned these solar panels to charge the automobile as well as generate electricity for his bunker. After seeing the shots, they realize Mark is still alive but decide to conceal it from the surviving astronauts. They plan to rescue him as soon as possible, but they are aware that it will be difficult because it takes months to reach Mars. A senior employee advises that they send food and supplies to Mars before attempting to rescue Mark, as their spaceship will take longer than the supply-carrying craft. After 70 days, Mark is still on Mars, trying to discover a way to connect with the Earth team. He decides to travel to the location where NASA will land for their upcoming project after 4 years, but his journey is more difficult than it appears because the vehicle he has is limited to 35 kilometers per day and needs to be recharged by solar power, so he must travel for 50 days to cover 3,200 kilometers. In a NASA conference, senior officials estimated that it will take roughly a year to send supplies to Mars for Mark if they go as usual, so they must move quickly to send supplies. They have another option, which is to tell the remaining astronauts to return to Mars and bring Mark alone, but this suggestion is opposed by many others, including the CEO, who is unwilling to risk the lives of the other 5 astronauts merely to save Mark. Here, Mark's farmed potatoes are now fully developed and ready to be harvested, giving him hope that he can now survive more than he was expecting. Mark applies all of his astronomical knowledge and figures out that in 1997, a Pathfinder on Mars stopped operating, so he travels there to repair it in the hopes of utilizing it to communicate with the Earth crew. Mindy observes his movement and understands he's on his way to the Pathfinder, so they turn on the Pathfinder receiver. Mark writes certain questions on boards, including, "Are you receiving me?" with yes and no boards on both sides. Mindy shifts the camera to the board with yes on it, signaling to Mark that NASA is watching him. This brings him great joy, and he believes that NASA will soon come to his aid. Following this confirmation, Mark communicates with NASA using code words, allowing them to successfully connect via messaging. NASA then informs the rest of Mark's team that he is still alive. They are all relieved that he is alive, but they are embarrassed for abandoning him to perish on Mars. After about 4 months, when everything is going well, a meteor strikes Mars and, unfortunately, lands in the chamber where Mark has planted his potatoes. Everything from Mark's crop to his water generation apparatus is destroyed as a result, reducing his chances of survival. Mark reports the mayhem to the Earth-based staff, which urges him to eat less in order to maximize the food he has. Then they proceed with their rescue mission, and the CEO decides to launch the supplies-carrying spacecraft without testing in order to save time. However, as soon as the spacecraft travels a certain distance, it is destroyed, consequently diminishing Mark's chances of survival. When Mark learns of this, he feels awful and loses hope of ever being rescued. He sends words to NASA headquarters, thanking his parents on his behalf for everything they have done for him and requesting that NASA inform his parents that their son was a brave and excellent astronaut. Now that the media has learned that Mark is alive on Mars and that NASA has failed to fly a supply spacecraft for him, they have begun to spread the news globally. When China's National Space Administration, CNSA, learns of this, they offer NASA assistance. NASA is preparing to launch another rescue spacecraft in 28 days with the assistance of CNSA. However, a guy named Rich Purnell, an astrodynamic engineer, suggests to NASA that instead of launching another spacecraft and wasting time on it, they should request the surviving astronauts in the Hermes spacecraft not to land on Earth but to orbit the Earth and then speed back to Mars using a slingshot. He adds that when they get close to Earth, they will send them a flying capsule stocked with food and supplies that they can use to survive for several weeks. Rich concludes by stating that Hermes should not be landed on Mars because it will require more fuel, so Mark has to utilize the spacecraft on Mars to reach Mars orbits and be picked up by his crew. As expected, NASA's CEO is not impressed by this idea, as he doesn't think it is acceptable to endanger the lives of other astronauts. Furthermore, by doing so, the survivor astronauts must spend 533 extra days away from their loved ones, which is a major drawback of this idea. However, before NASA can carry out its plan, Rich manages to notify the remaining astronauts on Hermes of his idea. The astronauts are unconcerned about their lives and decide to return to Mars to save their friend. Without asking the CEO for permission, the 5 astronauts in Hermes change direction and head back to Mars. All 5 astronauts make video calls to their families, apologizing for not returning home on the day they promised and receiving encouraging comments from their families to return to Earth with Mark. On Mars, Mark, who believes he will die soon, finishes the task they were doing before storm. When NASA notices Hermes returning to Mars, they realize that the astronauts have decided to rescue Mark, so with the help of CNSA, they fly a space capsule stocked with food and supplies to Hermes. Furthermore, they notify Mark to fix the spacecraft on Mars and be prepared to reach Mars orbits at any cost. Mark reaches the spacecraft and, as told by superiors, removes unnecessary components to lower its weight. For the sole purpose of shedding weight, he also takes the front portion of that spacecraft off and covers it with a parachute. Now he must reach Mars orbit in a spacecraft that could fail at any time, and he can swoon while taking off. Not just NASA and CNSA, but the entire world, are now waiting for Mark's rescue. Mark takes off in his flimsy spacecraft, but because of atmospheric pressure, he swoons and is unable to respond to his companion's signals from Hermes. Fortunately, after a brief period of unconsciousness, he regains consciousness and talks with the crew of Hermes. Everyone is now relieved that Mark is alive. Hermes' speed is extremely high, therefore, the ship's commander orders that a quarter of the spaceship be exploded to lower its speed. As a result, Hermes' speed decreases, and they can now clearly see Mark. The captain puts on her spacesuit and, with the assistance of a space couch, continues on her way toward Mark while anchoring herself to the Hermes. When she is set to reach him, the rope that is holding her back from Hermes tightens. Mark then displays bravery by making a hole in his suit, causing air to expel from it with pressure. As a result, he flies towards Commander but unfortunately misses grasping her hand. Luckily, Mark manages to grasp the rope that the Commander is using to secure herself, and the two successfully reach Hermes. Everyone, from his crew members to NASA and the rest of the world, is relieved that he has been rescued. The astronauts of the successful Mars mission then return to Earth. The scene then shifts to many years later, with Mark instructing new NASA astronauts on how to survive when they get stuck on another planet. Later on, the Ares 4 launches successfully, while the astronauts of the Mars voyage watch it on TV with their families and applaud it, marking the end of the film.
I hope you enjoyed the recap. If so, then give this video a thumbs up. And yes, if you want to be the first to know about my new videos, hit the subscribe button right now. It may seem worthless to you, but it is a huge motivator for me to keep going. I'll see you in my next video. Have fun and keep watching the Movie Explainer.